Okay. Good morning. I'm Selena Choate, the Vice President of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Welcome to day 2 of the 16th Annual Black New England Conference. If you were with us yesterday, you heard from some of the premier thinkers around conference theme, Where the Money Resides, an exploration of racialized access and historic exclusion from wealth, including Marsha Baradaran, author of The Color of Money, and Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law.
Good morning. You also engaged in meaningful dialogue that I'm sure enhanced our understanding of our complex history as it pertains to wealth building and race. I'm Jada Hebra, and I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer here at Southern New Hampshire University. And we at Southern New Hampshire University are so happy and proud to support the work of the Black Heritage Trail New Hampshire. This is our 4th year sponsoring the Black New England Conference, and we look forward to many years to come.
I'd like to thank SNU for being our major conference partner. And I'd like to take this moment to thank the rest of our conference sponsors, without whose support this conference would not be possible. We are supported by grants from the TD Foundation and Tito's Foundation. And we would like to thank our major sponsors, Eversource, Novacor, and Riverstone, as well as the many others who you see represented on the screen above and in your conference program.
So to get us started, we'd like to introduce the moderator of our first panel today, Wealth Matters in Black and White. Our lovely moderator is Melina Hill-Walker. She is a program director at the Endowment for Health, where she focuses on projects to advance health equity in New Hampshire. She has worked for Dartmouth's Aging Resource Center as a grants coordinator for visiting nurse and hospice for Vermont and New Hampshire, as a senior community health planner in New York City, and as a public health volunteer in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Without further ado, Melina.
Thank you, Jada and Selena. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. That's better, thank you. Well, I have the pleasure today of moderating our 4th panel, Wealth Matters in Black and White. And I'd like to start by, we have a couple panelists who are actually going to be zooming in remotely, Melanie and Joel Haas. Are they on yet? They're not on, okay. So I will read brief bios of each of the presenters, and then we will go to our second presenter, our 3rd and 4th, and then hopefully Melanie and Joel will have joined us by then. Following my introduction of each of the panelists will have a chance to reflect upon what each of them said, and then we will go to the Q&A. So please hold your questions until the last panelist has spoken. And those who are participating virtually, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will also try to get to them as quickly as possible after the 4th panelist. So before introducing our panelists, I'd like to recognize Rosary Broxay Cooper, in whose honor this panel is offered. Rosary Broxay Cooper moved to Portsmouth after meeting and marrying her husband, Owen Finnegan Cooper, in 1938. She took advantage of the opportunity afforded to women with the outbreak of World War II. Ms. Cooper got a job as a file clerk at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. She eventually became a 20-ton crane operator while her husband was in the Army. After the war, Cooper attended a beautician school and opened a shop in her home. She then served as the president of the Portsmouth Veterans of Foreign Wars. Cooper also became the state chairwoman of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Ladies Auxiliary. She died in 1997 at the age of 84. Melanie Haas, so Melanie and Joel, as I said, will be joining us remotely. Melanie Haas is an assistant teaching professor at Syracuse University. Before this position, she worked at colleges and universities in Texas and Arkansas, which fostered her dedication to diversity and inclusion. She was the lead editor and a contributor for Anti-Heroines of Contemporary Media, Saints, Sinners, and Survivors, published in late 2020. Joel Haas has spent the last 9 years with Saint-Gobain Abrasives in several different capacities, most recently as a technical sales rep. His research interests are in business and equity rhetoric and how they intersect with higher education pedagogy and racial and social justice. Nicole Sublet is a licensed clinical mental health counselor in private practice in Manchester, New Hampshire. She is also a doctoral student in natural medicine and studied power and influence for positive impact at Harvard Business School. Nicole is a member of the board of the National Alliance of Mental Illness in New Hampshire, NAMI, New Hampshire. Her practice specializes in women's issues, BIPOC, and LGBTQIA+ and racial trauma. Stephanie is a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire, seeking a doctorate in education with a focus on policy and leadership. She hopes to launch a program that will create a safe place for instructors in New Hampshire to discuss racialized issues that arise in education. Our fourth and final, well, he will be our third actually speaker, Daniel Fontenot, is pursuing a degree in higher education in environmental science with a focus on natural resource management. Daniel Fontenot has over 12 years of experience in corporate business management for the hospitality and healthcare industries, as well as 7 years in small business ownership and management in sports sciences in the outdoor recreation industry. So we'll now hear from Nicole.
Thank you, Melanie, and it's a pleasure to be here. I would like to start by sharing a story of a hardworking Black man, my father. During the 60s, my father grew up and was raised in the rural South. He, his siblings, and parents lived in what he described as a small shack that did not have running water, indoor plumbing, or electricity. He remembers having to use an outhouse as a bathroom. For food, he and his father would often go hunting. My father describes being able to efficiently skin rabbits and squirrels by the age of 10. They ate what they could hunt and forage. Food was not always readily accessible, easily storable, and there were nights they would go hungry. To earn money, my father would pick cotton alongside his siblings. The earnings were meager. My father was decent in school and always dreamed of attending college. Upon graduating high school, he decided to join the military in hopes of getting out of poverty and eventually attend college. While in the military, he met my mother and they started a relationship. When my father completed his time in the service, he and my mother moved, hoping to use his GI Bill for education benefits and housing opportunities. The need for housing and better economic mobility became more pressing once my mother became pregnant with me. My father tried to use his GI Bill. However, it was a time in which Veteran Affairs was primarily run by an all-white administration. Even with the GI Bill, my father faced discrimination with housing and education opportunities. My father was one of the many Black veterans struggling to get accepted into a college and often denied admissions due to the color of his skin. He was also denied housing loans, had limited choice of neighborhoods in which he would be welcome to live, and was steered toward doing menial jobs. My father worked in factories which still practiced segregation. At lunch, he would sit separate from his white co-workers. He listened to them make racist jokes and casually snare racist terms pointed in his direction. My father believed that by working hard, he would hopefully be promoted. Yet when it came time for work reviews, he was very rarely offered a raise, never mind a promotion. The financial stresses of poverty eroded the relationship between my mother and father. One day, a military buddy contacted my father, telling him about pipeline opportunities in the West. The job offered good money, and his buddy had a connection. My father accepted the invitation. It was his hope to earn enough money, send for us, and also make reparations with my mother. Taking what little money he could afford, my father left for the West Coast. However, when he arrived, the deal fell through. He had no way of coming back. My father was forced to find employment and was eventually hired at a low-wage job. He could barely afford a calling card to keep in touch with his family. My mother, frustrated with the situation and the inconsistent contact, eventually cut all ties with my father. To this day, I remember the last childhood conversation I had with my father. It was on the phone. It was my 4th birthday, and I eagerly asked him if he was coming home, and also if he had my coveted birthday wish, the 1983 black Barbie. I was hoping for a surprise gift. My Nana, who was my maternal grandmother, bought me the Barbie, but my father didn't come home. I didn't see him again until I was 28. Even with hard work, dedication, and even finally enrolling at a community college, it took my father decades to move from the cycle of poverty. Today, despite all his hard efforts to succeed, he is still trapped in a cycle of fluctuating employment and financial security. Today, I'm going to be talking about the myth of meritocracy and how it limits Black access to wealth. Meritocracy, what is it? According to Merriam-Webster, meritocracies are an elite group of people whose progress is based on ability and talent rather than on class, privilege, or wealth. The notion that everyone can achieve the American dream has long been central to American ideology. Epithets such as, "I believe the most qualified person should get the job," or "everyone can succeed in society if they work hard enough," have been at the heart of American culture. The term pulling oneself up by the bootstraps first made its appearance in 1834. Incidentally, the saying is supposed to be satirical and used as a metaphor for something impossible to achieve. However, many people believe this to be a truth and live by the notion if we're talented enough, work hard enough, and if we're judged by our merits, we will be successful and all our heart's desires will come true. Studies have found that many people believe the world is run in a meritocratic fashion. 70% of Americans regard as true that the poor can make it out of poverty on their own. It is this damaging narrative that is the driver in the racial wealth gap. Former president of the American Psychological Association, Daryl Wing Sue, in his book, Microaggressions and Marginality, asserts, "The ability of mainstream culture to ignore deteriorating circumstances of poor and working class Americans is intimately intertwined with the existence of classist microaggressions. We are distracted from full comprehension of either of these by what is popularly known the American dream, which coincides with a type of racial microaggression referred to as the myth of meritocracy." That was written by Daryl Wing Sue in 2010. Meritocracy as a cultural norm influences public policy, institutional ideologies, and social consciousness. The belief in meritocracy hinders economic justice. This is because lower economic status and social standing are seen as personal failures instead of the long-term effects of racism. The belief that citizens have finally been freed from the old world confines of class and heritage continues to shut out Black Americans out of wealth building. The government has historically created policies that support the rise of the white middle class, while at the same time excluding Black Americans. This was exemplified by the Homestead Act of 1862 in which the government gave 270 million acres of native land to white families. Studies show that 45 million white Americans today still are benefiting from this act. When the Emancipation Proclamation was written in 1862, Black people only owned 0.5% of the nation's wealth. This percentage has barely risen today. For Black Americans, getting married, obtaining an education, or buying a home does not lead to financial freedom. In fact, when getting credentialed at elite institutions of higher education is the test for status, power, and wealth, then actually most of us will become disempowered and devalued. In the book, Tyranny of Merit, Can We Find a Common Good by Michael J. Sandel, he explores meritocracy not as serving for a remedy for inequality, but as for a justification for inequality. Let me repeat that, as for a justification for inequality. In his book, Sandel looks at the fallacy of meritocracy in Ivy League admissions. He cites that at Harvard and other Ivy League institutions, there are more students from the top 1%, which is income of over 630,000, than the bottom half of the income distributor combined. Policies led by meritocracy result in a lack of support for those most in need, resulting in fewer welfare allocations and lack of affordable health care. Studies have shown that the poor health status of African Americans is predicated on unequal opportunity to achieve the American dream. Due to economic inequities, African Americans face increased risk of morbidity and mortality. Adverse health has been associated with the meritocratic ideology due to the increasing health, damaging, and high efforts to cope to overcome adversity. Pre-civil rights biases still show their ugly face in healthcare. A study found that a denial of racism was associated with hypertension among Black American respondents with less than a college degree. Experiences of discrimination and oppression increase cellular aging. We need to create actionable advocacy through social and economic policy interventions. The World Health Organization has 3 primary recommendations. 1, improve daily living conditions. 2, tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources. And 3, measure both the extent of health inequities and the impact of policy and action. Meritocracy is how we define success, failure, winners, and losers. I leave you with these questions of self-reflection. How do we view our own wins and losses? Can we take all the credit for our success? Does the hubris created by the meritocratic ideology prevent us from engaging in humility, social advocacy, and acting charitably? And finally, does meritocracy stop us from building equitable communities that lift everyone? Thank you.
So I had my speech printed out when I realized that the first 2 or 3 pages were blank because I ran out of ink. So I'm gonna have to just read this speech from my computer, if you guys don't mind. So I'm a 2nd-year PhD student at the University of New Hampshire. I am studying education with a focus on leadership and policy. One of the things that I'm very interested in discussing is the relationship between the racial wealth gap and the achievement gap. So today I'm presenting you with a paper that is pretty much my literature review on that subject. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so starting with the introduction. Racial wealth and the achievement gap are 2 phenomena that have been studied at length in the field of education, respectively. Even more are articles that discuss their intersectionality.
So much so that I wager we could fill this very room with peer-reviewed papers that focus on the variation in academic achievement, which can be attributed to socioeconomic status. However, most of those articles use income as the predictor for educational success and attainment. This is problematic for two reasons. The first is that when income is controlled, meaning when both groups being studied have the same income level, the achievement gap still exists. The second problem is that income is volatile and therefore is an unreliable predictor. For this reason, I will argue that wealth, not income, is a higher predictor for educational success and attainment. When I speak about the racial wealth gap, I am referring to the wealth disparity between white people and people of color. When I speak about the achievement gap, I'm referring to the difference between the achievement of all lower class and middle class students. Specifically speaking, I am referring to the gap between white students and students of color, which is even more comprehensive according to research. This contradistinction is critical to note because students of color from lower class communities are disproportionately marginalized as low performing. And this educational prescription is likely to determine their employment status as adults, thus contributing to this idea of social reproduction. Social reproduction, and I quote, describes the reproduction of social structures and systems based on particular preconditions in demographics, education, and inheritance of material property or legal titles. Reproduction is understood as the maintenance and continuation of existing social relations, end quote. In other words, wealth disparity threatens to maintain marginality within communities of color. However, I will not argue causality between wealth and education, but discuss the associations. Specifically speaking, I am going to highlight how wealth provides unmeasurable options in which to invest. One especially is the option of where to reside and how that choice predicates quality of education and educational success and opportunities. That said, I want to begin with a clear delineation of income and wealth, followed by a brief history and intersectionality of racial wealth and the achievement gap, ending with my conclusion, starting with wealth versus income. According to researchers in the field of education, quote, wealth and income are markedly different. Wealth measures the total supply of financial resources available to a family, whereas income measures the current stream of cash payments, end quote. Moreover, quote, wealth can provide income and income may eventually build to wealth, but wealth also has other beneficial characteristics that income does not have. Wealth brings stability. It generally does not change drastically over time in the way that income may. It can be passed on from generation to generation. Unlike income, it is not used for daily expenditures. It is used to create opportunities, secure desired stature and standard of living, or pass class along to one's children, end quote. This excerpt makes a fundamental distinction when considering the respective position of income and wealth to education. Obtaining a higher paying job can most certainly provide opportunities to invest in education. However, sustainability depends on the consistency of income. On those grounds, wealth is the stronger predictor for educational success and attainment. Nevertheless, distinguishing the historical context for which these gaps exist is more important to discuss. So now I'm going to talk about the historical context of these two. Before 1865, laws prohibited people of color from being able to produce wealth. Let me say that again. Being able to produce income, let alone wealth. Even when slavery was abolished with the inception of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War, the circumstances did not readily improve. Scores of African Americans were released without ever having received compensation for the generations of wealth they had produced for their white owners. Even when people of color were beginning to find their place in the economy, African Americans couldn't hold title to land and achieve freedom from debt. Examples include sharecropping and legal injunctions against Black homesteaders, compounded with events and situations such as the Oklahoma massacre, the birth of the KKK, decades of Jim Crow laws, lynching, mass incarceration, discrimination, HOLC and restrictive FHAs, as well as redlining, restrictive covenants as discussed in Rothstein's Color of Law, and not to mention literal violence. People of color are far behind in catching up to their white cohorts who have owned property and wealth since African Americans were considered property. Cited in a Ladson Billings article, Randall Robinson once said that, and I quote, "No nation can enslave a race of people for hundreds of years, set them free, bedraggled and penniless, pit them without assistance in a hostile environment against privileged victimizers, and then reasonably expect the gap between the heirs of these two groups to narrow. Lines begun parallel and left alone can never touch," end quote. So when you think of the racial wealth gap between white people and people of color, I want you to walk away with that notion in mind. Though, if when you leave here today, you can't recall those exact words, consider this, quote, "A recent study done in 2020 found that the median Black household with children took in about 50% of the income of white families, but held just 1% of wealth," end quote. And since wealth can influence educational opportunities, it is fascinating to highlight how the achievement gap came to be. So I'm going to talk about that now. So before Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case ruled that separate but equal accommodations between white people and people of color were constitutional. It took nearly 6 decades before the Supreme Court rescinded this decree in 1954. For half of a century, students of color either lacked access to education or were subjected to an education that paled to that of their white cohorts. In other words, let's consider this. Compulsory schooling has only been in progress for about 150 years. Of that, 75 of those years, students of color were taught in separate facilities that did not encompass the same educational resources or opportunities their white cohorts had been exposed to. By the same token, residential segregation sought to supersede the overturn of 54. Case in point, quote, "We understand that financial resources, including inheritance, ability to obtain high salary jobs, and manipulation of the higher educational market allow whites to effectively leverage resources to avoid cohabitating near Black and brown people who do not meet the financial profile of comfort created to embed their beliefs about minorities without having to articulate those beliefs directly." Let me clarify. That is, white people need not say they engage in housing or school segregation or articulate any direct belief against people of color, hence maintaining their virtue as whites, while cleverly manipulating their resources to live out the belief they do not wish to articulate. And the consequences are significant, as whites use their living situations segregated from people of color to provide better schooling situations and to draw higher tax bases to reinvest, end quote. This excerpt is significant because it underscores the relationship between wealth and education. It identifies how wealth creates educational opportunities. More importantly, it highlights how wealth can be orchestrated to establish and maintain social stratification, which is more insidious when you think about the parents of color who have been prosecuted in the past for enrolling their children into schools in communities they were not members of. Why does wanting a future filled with possibilities for your child have to be predicated on where you live? Are we not seeing the patterns of structural inequities? Or have we all adopted a sort of fetishist disavowal where we say to ourselves, I know, but I don't want to know that I know, so I don't know. Whether we admit it or not, there is a relationship between wealth and disparity. There is a relationship between wealth disparity and academic achievement. I do not stop existing because you refuse to acknowledge me. And as much as we ignore the achievement gap, despite the call for accountability measures, let's name them, A Nation at Risk, No Child Left Behind, Every Student Succeeds Act, it still exists. And we can either continue to give lip service or face reality. So in conclusion, wealth influences academic achievement and is a higher predictor of success. To what degree depends on the variables and other exogenous factors. As stated, wealth determines community, education, and social status. And this is important because wealth disparity also determines one's community, education, and social status. So when you decide where to reside next, and you choose the type of education you would like your child to be exposed to, I want you to be aware of your ability to choose in this regard. And I want you to think about those who can't. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm from Vegas. It's really cold up here. How's everybody doing today? All right, I'm just gonna go ahead and get right into it. My name is Daniel Fontenot, environmental scientist, director of ProWlydSolutions, which is Black-owned, veteran-owned, and federally registered to handle anything from human-wildlife conflict to natural disaster response. We have a unique set of stakeholders that I've personally acquired through cultural submersions and doing things like this, public speaking. And two questions I'm always asked is why and how I do what I do. The how is a standard method of labor in military culture. It's to hustle, self-motivate, overcome challenges, persevere, wake up, and then do it again. The why is more lengthy. Could it be my love of animals since watching Crocodile Hunter or Zaboomafoo on PBS? Could it have been my first interaction with Asian, Middle Eastern students in military or boarding schools 100 miles from my hometown? Or was it during the pandemic when millions of people contracted a zoonotic disease known as COVID-19? Either way, I shared my story, gained followers in real time and on Instagram. But before I romanticize too much on successes, let's dial into the barrier to these successes. The first, natural resource management is an old practice dating back to 1000 AD, where Native Americans developed intricate canals in the Nevada desert to control flooding. Colonials would later utilize that same technique to prevent water from getting to their lands. Methodologies of natural resource management have adapted over time as globalism continues to grow. For example, the inequities of global trade, imports and exports, shows us whichever country controls the flow of natural resources also holds the most in economic and political power, like those who know how to fish a river compared to those who can control the flow of said river. Due to its age, I will only focus on the 1800s, the period of the enslaved, runaway, and freed Blacks, to the mid to late 1900s, where desegregation finally spread to the first federal entity in charge of resource management, established in 1776, the U.S. Corps of Engineers. All of the sources I have gained are from government archives, census, tax, titles, deeds, easily accessible if you know where to look, if you're targeted. Now I'll break down the barriers by 3 sections: federal, state, and private. The federal plane. The U.S. Corps of Engineers was established with the independence of our nation, 1776, yet have only 12% Black employees today. Only a handful of us have been in leadership position. The first African-American General Hugh Robinson, it's about 1978. And the second, first African-American female to work for them is an infamous whistleblower, Bunny Greenhouse. And I'll say the name again, Bunny Greenhouse. I suggest you look her up. In the 1800s, federal projects brought jobs to the public. That public was at least 85% white. And although of lower income, especially with events like Civil War, Great Depression, World Wars, the benefits were outstanding for the majority. Government housing, which were equivalent to modern suburban homes, company payrolls upwards of 100K, which today is about $1 million, and land estates and grants for those who stayed after the work to benefit from historical site incentives. The Hoover Dam's contractor, 6 companies, you should look them up if you don't know. 6 companies would employ thousands of white laborers. It was only when Black unions were formed, we had to form them ourselves, were formed that the government focused them to hire for Blacks or be fined. So they hired 30 to work in latrine cleanup and sediment removal. On the state level, many state projects were too small for federal involvement or too large for government spending. Projects like the Erie Canal would rather adhere to the Naturalization Act of 1790 and hire former European immigrants with no experience in canal management than the natives who occupied the territory. The trend to hire naturalized Europeans would continue even after former slaves were federally naturalized in 1870. In the 17th and 18th centuries, states would enjoy the benefit of welcoming rich lords from Scotland, Germany, France, who were fleeing persecution and would purchase thousands of acres of American soil. Likewise, in the 1920s and so on, soldiers would come from World War I and other wars with land granted to them for anything from agricultural to mineral harvesting. Many states even hired white convicts escaping persecution over Blacks. West Virginia was one of the first states to hire over 25% of Blacks in the coal mining industry, arguably the most health hazardous occupation to date. Regardless, heroes like Carter Woodson, the creator of Black history, this is very small, I apologize. Heroes like Carter Woodson, the creator of Black history, and third grad from Harvard would toil in these mines to pay for his college, which was better than sharecropping, in my father's opinion. The private level. Privately owned environmental clubs have furthered the term environmental racism past the 1980s mark and onwards to more recently 2020. Only after the nation paused to see how police brutality and systematic racism increased Black deaths and poverty were these entities scrambling to create poorly staffed and undermarketed diversity and inclusion departments. By the 1980s, entities like the Audubon Society, Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council were under scrutiny for the lack of outreach to minorities. The Sierra Club denounced their founder, John Muir, if you know who that is. John Muir in 2020, due to his belief in scientific racism and that nature should be protected more than Blacks and natives. Madison Grant, should look him up as well, a friend of John Muir and an environmental advisor to Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, would write The Passing of the Great Race, a book idealizing Nordic whites' control and management over nature. Statistically, environmental nonprofits are started and owned by the white, middle, and upper class, who historically claim to enjoy nature in order to escape the eyesores of the lower class slums, which is mostly populated by Black and brown people, instead of solving the issue, of course. Why? So again, I'll go back to the why. Natural resource management provides skills that transfer professionally, like levee construction, and recreationally, like hunting and fishing, furthering generational sustainability. Small businesses in jewelry, clothing, food, grocery, and holistic health, all the way up to corporate businesses, mining, lumber, land conservation, water conservation, even biomed, getting the chemicals from plants and using them for medications. That makes sense. Black generations have been excluded from every major environmental decision in America, while whites benefit from engineering, resort-style views, and tax incentives from targeted land and waterway management to this day. That's my time, I believe.
I'm checking on Melanie and Joel. Are they online? No, they're not. Okay. All right. Well, I first of all want to thank our three panelists, Nicole, Stephanie, and Daniel. Thank you so much. Nicole, you gave us a very powerful story about your father and his challenges with finding not only decent education, but employment and being able to support his family. And Stephanie, you talked to us about the racial wealth gap and achievements and the relationship between wealth and achievement. And Daniel, you spoke to us about the environment and opportunities for engagement, employment, and we didn't mention environmental racism issues, but obviously that too is part of your presentation. What I'd like to do is to allow each one of the panelists to reflect and share just one thought about how they heard the other presentations and how it might inform their presentation. So Nicole, I'm going to ask you to go first, and then Stephanie, and then Daniel. And after that, we'll then go to Q&A.
Is this on? Oh, it's on. Okay. Oh. I just want to say that I'm really honored to be sitting here amongst all the folks and also with this incredible, incredible panel. It was really good, and I was trying to scribble down some notes that I really actually can't read because I was writing so fast. But I can see the connection with all of that we speak about, and thinking about Stephanie and how she was prolifically highlighting the difference between income and wealth, and just also thinking about meritocracy and this idea that, you know, if we work hard enough, and so for a lot of people, they don't really think about the difference between wealth and income. So some people are like, oh, I've got a six-figure job, or I've got this and I finally made it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are accumulating or establishing wealth. And so that's really huge in how actually wealth is oftentimes intergenerational. And then I think about also how that combines with Daniel's talk about the environmental considerations and how Blacks and people of color have really been excluded from environmental decisions, and how that also ties into wealth and legacy and, you know, land ownership in general, and people who owns the land versus people working the land, like my father in picking cotton. So I can see all the intertwining threads of this, and I think it's really beautiful, and I just want to thank you all.
I could see that these mics are already on, so we don't need to check that. So I appreciate that laugh. So what I saw as I guess you could say, the connecting theme between all three of our presentations was actually this idea of segregation. Segregated in terms of the work that people of color were relegated to, segregation in terms of what your father had experienced in terms of where he wanted to live, not having those opportunities. And so when you think about it, it's
it's not just the idea that we want to be in the same room, right? Like we want to be in the same room with the same resources. We want to be exposed to all of the things in which our cohorts, our white cohorts have access to. So we're not just arguing for the fact that we'd like to sit in the room with you. We want to sit at the table. Right. And so what I'm recognizing as a connectivity between all of these ideas is that there's so much of this government sanctioned segregation, things that we don't actually acknowledge and talk about, right? Like we like to pretend like it just happened by mistake, but it didn't happen by mistake. This was by design. And so based on that design, we are excluded from certain opportunities. We are excluded from having the same potential and just things in which we would like to share a part of and be a part of. We're excluded from those things. And that exclusion is usually what determines what our future looks like. And this is not to say that everybody has the same experience, right? Like I grew up in poverty, but that doesn't necessarily mean that just because I grew up in poverty, it doesn't mean that I will never have opportunities. I did, but those opportunities were hard fought. Those opportunities came through actual networking, right? They didn't just land on my plate. So poverty is not the same for everybody. Segregation is not going to impact everyone exactly the same. But what is the same is that we do not have exposure to those things that we know for a fact that our white cohorts do.
Very good. It's hard to piggyback off of that, but I grew up upper middle class. So to your point there, I'm on the very different spectrum. I didn't grow up poor. I didn't grow up, in the hood per se. But my parents today are still working to keep up with all that stuff. That makes sense. So, but if you know or don't know, some of these areas, I grew up in Atlanta, some of these areas that are more upper class, 30 minutes down the road, hour down the road, you have the hood. So many of my friends are were not in the position I was in. And it's really why I do what I do. Again, going from lower class to upper class, I hear stories and I understand the struggle of it. Me being in country clubs and stuff like that and playing tennis amongst, the majority that stay in that club, I've learned some things as well. And I refuse to just sit down and enjoy the privilege that I had because there are some restrictions just because of my color. So reflecting on the other presenters though, I mean, it's uncanny how the stories just align and how everything is just synchronized like that. And it's very difficult for me to understand how, I knew this information when I was like 14. So to be honest with you, but it's just very difficult to understand how I, even in a privileged position, still was able to stumble upon or actually search for this information. And yet those not of my color in that privileged position don't know. So.
So I'd like to go now to both the questions in the room and questions on chat. Are there any questions in the room first?
Good morning. Thank you all for your presentations. They were fantastic. I'm curious to know from Stephanie and Nicole if you have thoughts around how HBCUs in particular might be able to help address this achievement gap and also the issues around sort of meritocracy and the myth of meritocracy. How, they were created for a purpose, right? There was a specific need, and perhaps that need somewhat still exists today. Are they part of the solution or should they be part of the solution?
Could you just define HBCUs for those who don't know what it is?
Historically, wait, is it on? Hello? Okay. That's historically Black colleges or universities. That's HBCUs. So yeah, I definitely feel like they should play a role. This is a conversation that we were having yesterday. Give me an opportunity to think about it. So just to understand what you were saying, you're asking how should they play a role in terms of the achievement? Okay, so in that regards, I do feel like it's important that we try and reinvest and pool, money in that regard so that we can produce those educational opportunities, or we can just simply have those resources in place. And I also feel like it should be something that, sorry, when people put me on the spot, I got to think about my responses. So, but yeah, so like, I do feel like education in that regard, especially when we're talking about HBCUs, HBCUs should really try and invest their money, I would say actually in a pool altogether, right? And create even more opportunities to have available for students of color so that those opportunities are available to them so that they are able to have, why can't I speak? I'm so sorry. So that they can just simply have options available to them. That's what I'm really getting at, right? So I'm thinking about this idea of just creating resources that give students of color options. I don't know why I couldn't say that before, but I finally got there.
I'd also like to give Nicole the opportunity to respond to that question vis-a-vis the myth of meritocracy.
Yes, I think that they're very important because it's important that we have community and we need places for people to, there's no such thing really as a safe space, but there's definitely such thing as gracious spaces. And when I think about higher academia, and also as a psychotherapist and to many of my clients who are in higher education institutions and in higher education institutions that are not primarily people of color and mostly white, and what they face and what they really face, they're always having to reassert themselves. They're always having to prove themselves valid. And I see on the other end is heartbreaking. I see insomnia, anxiety, depression, not eating, because my clients feel like they can't find their place in these institutions. And a lot of these institutions, they call it affirmative action, but the thing is, diversity does not mean inclusivity, and inclusivity is really important. And I see Dottie Morris raising her hand. That was quick. I feel like I should apologize. I'm sorry, I was just kind of scratching my head. Oh.
One thing I wanted to say, there's a great book that was just published called Shelter in the Storm. And I think the colon is how historically Black colleges created a generation of leaders. So when you look at all of a lot of the leaders, when we think about our Vice President of the United States attended an HBCU, when we listened to the dear brother last night. So this whole idea around the role that HBCUs are playing, it's a major role because it prepares students in such a way. If you think about going to Morehouse or Spelman, or if you think about going to Delaware State, there's some really significant lifelong lessons that prepare the students like you're talking about, who are in, because I work at one of those, where students are always trying to figure out and navigate their identity in a stormy place. So there is a place for that. So I apologize for.
Thank you, Dottie. Before we go, I know there are additional questions in the room and we'll get to in a minute, but I wanted to ask, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, we have a question, and this is specifically for Nicole. Can Nicole repeat the WHO recommendations, and can Stephanie repeat the Randall Robinson quote?
Absolutely. Where's that voice coming from? Oh,
Right here.
it's like,
I
I
wanted
felt-
to leave it the mystery, but now you
Uh,
ruined the mystery.
oh,
So thank you.
oh, the voice behind the curtain. I was like,
Yes,
where-
Wizard of Oz.
Yes, so the World Health Organization's 3 primary recommendations are: 1, to improve daily living conditions; 2, tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources; 3, measure both the extent of health inequities and the impact of policy and action.
By the way, this is my favorite quote and my call for reparations. Okay, so Randall Robinson once said, "No nation can enslave a race of people for hundreds of years, set them free, bedraggled, and penniless, pit them without assistance in a hostile environment against privileged victimizers, and then reasonably expect the gap between the heirs of the two groups to narrow. Lines begun parallel and left alone can never touch."
That's geography. Is there another question from the chat before we go to the room?
Sorry, yes, we have one more. This one, I believe, is for everyone. What sources of support are each of these panelists drawing upon as they chart their ways forward in their careers? How can our broader community be supportive of them?
Thank you. We'll start with Daniel.
Coincidentally, I'm supporting the community. I'm just hiring people that are, I'm taking care of the less recognized people, creating a service where the service is not. So people that again, like I said, lower education, lower income areas, people that are plagued by former sentencings, veterans, been forgot about. These people are all people as well. And, you know, being that I have the resources to pull them up or look back and extend my hand, I do so.
So each one of you is also studying. So what kind of resources, Daniel, or how are you finding the support for your studies?
Oh, for me, yes, environmental science is what I study, and SNHU is helping me with that. So, yeah, that the education portion of it is a huge support for me.
Thank you, Daniel. We'll go to Stephanie.
I wrote my response down this time because you tripped me up last time. Okay. I definitely feel supported already by my advisors, my professors, people that I've met on campus, people who are here in this very crowd. I'm making eye contact with all of you. Okay, thank you. I also definitely need networking support, right? This is actually my first conference, so thank you so much for being gracious. So I'm well aware that, you know, in order to succeed, we have to do this as a community, right? And I want my community to look like everybody in this room, not just me, right? Not just the color of what I am, but I'm looking for that networking and that level of support.
Thank you. And Nicole?
I find a lot of support from my family, my spouse. They're highly encouraging of me. Being part of professional networks for people of color is really important in professional development. Colleagues who are also in mental and behavioral health are good supports. And then also through my school, in my school, it's natural medicine. So we're learning a lot about native medicine and also finding ways that we can return the body to what is called homeostasis, which is the perfect state of being, and using other modalities that go outside of psychopharmacology. And I think that it's really important, though, in mental health and in medicine to be part of community, because communities for people of color, and even as Dr. Kendi was talking about last night, people are dying. And it's unfortunate. And there are so many inequities and biases in healthcare that still exist today. When I hear about some of the questions that are asked to people of color, some of the exams that are completely obsolete are still happening. The diagnoses, here I get going now, but like, and how Black men are disproportionately diagnosed with schizophrenia and given first-class antipsychotics. And so that's why I think support and being in community is really, really important so we can start healing, literally healing communities.
Nicole, I'd like to ask you to talk. Thank you. Just for the benefit of all of us here and given your expertise, what are some of the other ways that people could find support outside of pharmacology?
So once again, it goes back to community. For a lot of people, spirituality, church is a huge protective factor. Seeing what's out there, there's so many, even though New Hampshire is not geographically known for being diverse, and I know this is a New England conference, but there are communities out there. And so it's really looking to see who is out there and reaching out. And people can certainly, my name is Nicole Sublette. I am one of the very few Black licensed psychotherapists in the state. So you can always find me. I'm always trying to plug in communities. So you can always definitely reach out to me, Nicole Sublette. I feel like I'm plugging myself, Nicole Sublette. For president. Reach out to me and I am more than willing to be of support to anyone.
Thank you, Nicole. You've been very patient, sir. Your question?
I'm over here just so, you know. I realize saying over here doesn't really, anyway, that's beside the point. My question primarily is for Daniel. Being someone that, well, to be honest with you, I came out here because of the environment, the natural environment, that is, to work with kids outside, without really knowing what New Hampshire was all about. That was my bad. But it's a good thing. I'm still here. But, you know, but anyway, I work a lot with some boards like land conservation boards in New Hampshire, which are predominantly white spaces. And I know why I'm there, because I love the environment. Yep. And other reasons. And what I do tend to get in those spaces is what can we do to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in those spaces, meaning the natural spaces. And I give my answer, but I'm curious about what you would say to those folks that are like, you know, especially like land conservation folks. Like, how do we want to make it inclusive? And okay, so here's my answer, but I'm curious what you would say.
And they asked you that question?
Oh yeah.
And it's just you. Okay.
That's how I roll. That's not region.
Yeah, that's the start, is at least employing more people besides him. Like a support team to help him out. But yeah, literally that's the start. Just employ more people. And when you want your inclusive and diversity department, or if you have one, you should have one by now. You need to properly staff them. There's too many complaints that I'm hearing of inclusive and diversity departments, and people are understaffed. Or, I mean, even at the top, the president's advisor for environmental protection, it's not her office isn't even fully staffed. There's open chairs. So that's basically a start.
Thank you, Daniel. Other questions in the room? I see one over here. I see one over here. We can take right here. And there's one over here. And one to the far right.
I was really struck by your comment that there are no safe spaces, but there are gracious spaces. And I'm wondering, as a follow-on to my friend Doug's question here, could you give some ideas about what makes a space gracious, even if it can't be safe?
Yes, so A gracious space allows for imperfection, for mistakes to be made, and to know that we're all on this journey together and that we're all here to actually learn from one another. And in a gracious space, harm can be done, but also harm can be rectified and repaired. And so that's the importance of a gracious space, because it allows us all an opportunity to learn, because we're all holders of knowledge and we're all students.
Thank you, Nicole.
Hello? I need a better hello. Hello. This is for all of you, if you like. This is really for Doug and for Daniel. I asked Doug that question in the dinner line last night because I'm on the board of a land trust, and land trust cooperation came up yesterday. And I've been an environmentalist since the first Earth Day. I was 11, handing out buttons, and have done a lot of work in environmentalism and climate change action since then, which is a long, long time. And I am sorry to say that while I might have couched this in no environment, no planet, no planet, no people, I was not being inclusive. If I look at Greenpeace, the Natural Defense Resource Council, all of these organizations are very well endowed by wealth of white people. That's what I've learned in the last 24 hours. So I'm pretty stunned to be here. I am inspired and invigorated, which is what people were talking about yesterday. But I want to know, going forward in my environmental work, literally, how to be more inclusive, how to not be whitewashing, the greenwashing, and what we can do. I have a nephew who graduated this year with a PhD in natural resources from UVM. I actually really want to put you together with him. I think you guys would like each other. So, I mean, as a white person, if I ask, hey, what can I do? It was, one of the comments last night was how, it was actually transformed to how to empower what to do, how to shift that, transfer that. So Daniel, Doug, all of you, what can we do? And how can, in the environmental and climate change movements, in fact, be more inclusive? Rather than just a land trust, hey, we're going to buy a piece of land, let's put some housing on it. I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but I'm very inspired and infuriated.
So simply, I'll just say spending on Black communities. There's a lot of holistic things coming out, CBD things, there's just a lot of entrepreneurship in holistic medicine and natural remedies, and a lot of people of color are doing that or being involved in that. So I suggest that the start will be to buy those products and fund them, because environmentalism itself, environmental scientists themselves, scientists in general, are typically broke. We don't have money, right? So, but dialing back to support the minorities in that category, support those businesses that want to push holistic and natural remedies.
Thank you, Daniel. Stephanie or Nicole?
Hi, I wrote it down again. So, so I would say this is really not my jurisdiction, but I do have some suggestions. So I would say recruit with intention, right? Make sure that you are recruiting people of color if possible, or people who exist in different spaces. Make sure that your initiative, whatever that is aligning with the goals and values of the people in which you're hiring. I would also say continue to expand, right? Make sure that it's not just a localized initiative. Make sure that you are looking beyond, and also make sure your initiatives have diversity, inclusion, and all of the other things in which we're discussing. Make sure it's a part of the work you do, right? Because if you don't integrate it into the work you're doing, if it's not a part of your goals, no matter if you have a person of color working with you, it's lip service, so to speak, you know? So just make sure that all of those things are matching and that those things are aligned.
I want to talk about, when we're talking about inclusivity and environmentalism, I think a really important question is asking, well, who does it benefit? Who does the land trust benefit? And when I think of land, I think of food. And I think that it's really important that we also stop pathologizing hunger and looking at hunger as a personal deficit. And so when we're looking at conservation, we need to also look at building our communities and feeding our families and making sure that people have access to clean water and good food. And I think of food deserts, and well, that's where it's just start going. But once again, it's about who are we benefiting through environmentalism, and do those who are most marginalized and oppressed, are they being benefited and are they being lifted?
Thank you, Nicole. There's been a young lady over there who's been waiting quite a long time, so we'll have her ask a question.
Thank you. This is primarily for Daniel, but I think Stephanie, you got at it a little bit, but I want to dig deeper. Say you're in charge of equitable hiring at the Sierra Club. What's the next move?
Did everybody hear the question?
Like
Say
where
you're
to
in charge.
find Black environmentalists or something, or minorities who are environmentalists?
Yeah.
Do you want to repeat the question, Daniel? I'm not sure everybody heard it.
So she was saying,
I can repeat it too, if that's helpful. So say you are in charge of equitable hiring at the Sierra Club that has just disavowed John Muir. What are you doing?
okay, we hiring Black biologists, Black or Native with people of color from HBCUs. Yeah, I mean that's what they're there for. For example, I have a sister-in-law who graduated wildlife biology. Oh, sorry, marine biology. I apologize. It's very different. And she doesn't do it anymore. I've ran into multiple people, biologists who graduated, former biologists who graduated from HBCU, Savannah State, Tuskegee, FAMU, and the like. And they don't do it anymore. It's too many boundaries. Nobody hiring them with the same faces. No team to support them. And that's basic.
Again, not my jurisdiction, but I got a suggestion for you. Okay, so I would say do some research, right? Actually go out and identify the places that are very similar to what your institution looks like, that already has equitable practices that are actually working. So find some of those institutions, do some research with your team, make sure it's not just one person, right? Like we have to make sure that everybody's eating a slice of this pie. Make sure that you are identifying which ones you feel could potentially help what your goals are. And it's really important that everybody has the same goals, right? So just make sure that you are matching those things and aligning those things. And I feel like you should find your solution at first. And it may work like a therapist, right? Where you got to shop around just a little bit, but you'll at least have some options out there for you to consider.
Thank you, Daniel and Stephanie. We might have time for one more question, and then I would like to ask each of the panelists to leave us with one thought. That gives you time to think about it.
So this question circles back to the chat question, how can we support your work? You all provided some really great, professional, and appropriate answers to that question. You're all students. And so my question is, what is your Cash App? We're talking about where the money resides. We're talking about supporting Black folk who are doing the work. What is your Cash App? What is your Venmo so we can bless you?
To take it literally, I have a 501c7 Black Wildlife. So you can go on that website and donate accordingly.
I don't remember my Cash App. I think it's like $9510. Don't ask me why. I'm pretty certain it's that, but I can always confirm once I get back to my phone.
Same here. I don't know what my Cash App is. I think it's just under my name, Nicole Sublette.
Sir, you who asked the question, would you like to define what a Cash App is for those who don't know?
So Cash App is a person-to-person money transfer system, right? It's an electronic money-to-money, person-to-person transfer system. So if we want to support these individuals and you have the Cash App, you can literally send them money to support them and their food, their eating, their tuition, all that kind of stuff. There's Cash App, there's Venmo. I'm shocked y'all don't know yours. I'm older than all y'all, and I can tell you my Cash App right now.
Let
You
me
want to send me
explain.
some money, I got you.
Let me explain. I use Zelle. That's the reason why. Yeah, I use Zelle.
So while they're trying to figure out their Cash App so they can get that money, it is 10:15, but I did want to give each one of our fantastic panelists an opportunity to just give a very brief final thought for the room. Who would like to go first? I'm not going to assign you this time. Daniel, you're first. Thank you.
Really, employment, diversity in employment is very important. I just targeted mine towards environmental careers and infrastructure. So just leaving with the remark of, there are plenty of us out here. There's plenty of us hunting, fishing. Sorry, I'm not used to mics. I usually walk around and talk. There's plenty of people hunting, fishing, plenty of us hunting, fishing, creating things out of nothing. Plenty of opportunity to hire these people at whatever level you want to put them at, but also remember where economically they are and to pay them appropriately, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Daniel.
With enough benefits.
Thank you, Daniel. Stephanie?
I feel like I said everything, but no, it's like, I guess just to recap, it's this idea that I really believe that we should be more aware of the opportunities that we have allotted to us based on our financial positioning. And I feel like instead of focusing on your slice, that we should be thinking along the lines of how everyone can get a piece of that. So whether that means busing kids to schools in different districts, whether that means equalization of funding between districts, New Hampshire, we got some work to do, right? Yeah. But in any regard, I feel like education should be for everyone, right? Not just for the people who can afford it or the people who have access to certain opportunities. It should be for everyone. And I want us to think about what we can do to be advocates of change, right? This is a conference. We're doing all of these beautiful thoughts and ideas, but what are we going to do when this conference is over, right? Like, are we just going to go home and talk about like the tidbits that we really enjoyed? Let's think about what it is that we can do ourselves and within our communities that's going to help us to bridge this gap, because we can't do it by ourselves. We just can't.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Nicole.
I think that for my takeaway, for us to really, as I stated in my speech, that to think about how we actually define our success and how we define ourselves. I know that we live in a society that's so production based, and we're all just so drawn to the hustle and just making it somewhere up some ladder that probably has no top or crushing some glass ceiling. And what I think we need to really do, as Stephanie says, she's talking about sharing a slice of the pie, but also is like, it's about how we, as we grow, and how when we grow in our own power, how we still practice humility and empathy for one another, so we can actually build one another up instead of being so individually focused on our own success. How can we share our successes? Because none of us operate alone. None of us operate in a vacuum. We're all connected on a greater level. We're all one. Peace, love. So I just want to end with that. So just reminded of all of our beautiful connection and how every little action, every single little action really impacts someone else, even if you don't recognize it in the moment.
Thank you. Please give it up for our speakers.